Story 1. The Watcher in the Woods. My name is Ethan Carter, and this is not a story. This is a warning. What I'm about to tell you is real. It happened to me, to my best friend, Nathan Reed, and to countless others who've dared to enter the Blackroot Forest in Montana. If you're reading this, do yourself a favor. Stay away from that place. It's not just a forest, it's a predator. And once it sees you, it never lets go. It started as a simple hiking trip. Nathan and I had been adventure buddies for years, always chasing the next thrill. We'd hiked through the Rockies, camped in the Mojave, and even explored abandoned towns in the Midwest. But Blackroot Forest was different. Even before we set foot in it, there was something about the way people talked about it, or rather the way they didn't. The locals called it the Hungry Woods. They said people went in and never came out. They talked about a figure that watched from the shadows, a presence that followed you home. But we didn't believe them. We were skeptics, rational thinkers. Ghost stories were just that, stories. Still, there was something about the way they avoided eye contact when we asked about the forest. Something about the way they whispered the name Blackroot like it was a curse. It was enough to make me hesitate, but Nathan was determined. "Come on, Ethan," he said, grinning. "You're not scared, are you?" I wasn't scared, not exactly. But there was a feeling in my gut, a gnawing unease that I couldn't shake. Still, I wasn't about to let Nathan go alone. We arrived at the trailhead on a crisp October afternoon. The air smelled of pine and decaying leaves, and the forest stretched out before us like a living thing. The trail was overgrown, the signpost barely legible. "Blackroot Trail closed. Enter at your own risk." Nathan snapped a photo of it, grinning. "Looks like we're breaking the rules already." We hiked for hours, the trees closing in around us as the sun dipped below the horizon. The forest was dense, the canopy so thick that even in the daylight, it felt like twilight. The ground was soft underfoot, covered in a thick layer of moss and fallen leaves. Every now and then we'd hear the distant call of a bird or the rustle of an animal in the underbrush. But as the sun set, the forest grew eerily quiet. By the time we set up camp, the forest was pitch black, the kind of darkness that feels heavy, oppressive. We built a fire, cooked some food, and tried to shake off the unease that had settled over us. But the forest was too quiet. No crickets, no owls, no rustling of animals in the underbrush, just silence. Around 11 p.m., I heard it. A faint whistling sound, like someone humming a tune just out of earshot. It was soft at first, almost melodic, but there was something off about it. The notes were wrong, discordant, like a broken music box. "Do you hear that?" I asked Nathan. He paused, listening. "Hear what?" Before I could answer, the whistling stopped. The forest fell silent again, but this time, the silence felt deliberate, like the trees were holding their breath. Then came the scream. It was distant at first, muffled by the trees. But as it grew louder, it became unmistakable. A human scream, raw and desperate. It cut through the night like a knife, sending a jolt of adrenaline through my body. Nathan froze, his eyes wide. What the hell was that? I didn't have an answer. The scream stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving behind a silence so heavy it felt like the forest itself was holding its breath. We tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe it was the wind. But deep down, we both knew better. Animals don't scream like that. By 2 a.m., Nathan was exhausted. "Let's just get some sleep," he said, crawling into the tent. I followed, but sleep was the last thing on my mind. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of a branch set my nerves on edge. And then I saw it, a figure standing just outside the tent. At first I thought it was Nathan, but when I turned my head, he was lying beside me, his breathing slow and steady. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for my flashlight. The moment I turned it on, the figure moved, not like a person, but like a shadow slipping through the trees. Nathan woke up immediately. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice groggy. "There's someone out there," I whispered, my voice trembling. We unzipped the tent and stepped outside, the cold night air biting at our skin. The forest was eerily still, the fire reduced to embers. And then we saw it. A tall, gaunt figure stood against a tree, its pale face illuminated by the moonlight. Its eyes were hollow, its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. It didn't move, it didn't breathe, it just stood there, watching us. Nathan shone his flashlight at it, and for a moment I thought it might disappear. But then it shifted, not walking, not running, but simply appearing closer, as if it had teleported. "Run!" Nathan shouted. We bolted, our feet pounding against the forest floor. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches clawing at our clothes. No matter which way we turned, the figure was always there, ahead of us, behind us, beside us. It moved without sound, its hollow eyes never leaving us. By the time we reached the Jeep, I was gasping for air. Nathan fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly he could barely get them in the ignition. I glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. There were 3 of us in the car. Me, Nathan, and the thing sitting in the back seat. I screamed, and Nathan slammed the gas pedal to the floor. We tore through the forest, the trees blurring into a dark haze. Even when we reached the main road, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We didn't talk about what happened that night. Not for weeks. But the Watcher didn't forget us. Strange things started happening. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of whistling outside my window. Nathan swore he saw the figure standing in his backyard, watching him through the glass. We both felt it, the presence, the eyes, always on us. A month later, Nathan disappeared. The police found his car abandoned near the edge of Blackroot Forest, but there was no sign of him. No footprints, no struggle, nothing. Just an empty car and a faint whistling sound in the air. I don't know what's out there. A ghost, a demon, or something else entirely. All I know is this. If you stay in Blackroot past midnight, something watches you. And if you see it, it never forgets you. Story 2. The Voices in the Woods. My name is Daniel Myers, and I never should have ignored the warnings. I've always loved the outdoors, camping, hiking, getting away from the noise of the city. I've done it all. But after what happened in Black Hollow Forest, I don't go anywhere near the woods anymore. This was 2 years ago. It was supposed to be a normal weekend trip. Me and my 3 closest friends, Eric, Sam, and Josh. We had been planning it for months, choosing a secluded area far from civilization in northern Oregon. Locals had warned us about strange disappearances in the region. Hikers had gone missing, their campsites found abandoned, their gear untouched. There were even stories of voices in the woods, people claiming to hear their own names being called, only to vanish without a trace. We thought it was just small-town folklore, but now I know better. We arrived at the Black Hollow trailhead in the late afternoon. The forest was dense, the trees towering like ancient sentinels. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, but there was something else, a faint, metallic tang that made the back of my throat itch. The hike in was about 4 miles, and by the time we found a clearing to set up camp, the sun was already dipping below the horizon. The forest grew darker faster than I expected, the shadows stretching long and twisted across the ground. Something felt off from the start. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an unnatural silence. Josh joked, "Maybe the trees are listening." We all laughed. But as we set up our tents, I caught movement in my peripheral vision, a shadow between the trees. When I turned, there was nothing. I told myself it was my imagination. By midnight, we were sitting around the campfire, drinking beers and telling stories. The fire crackled, casting flickering light on our faces. That's when we heard it, a voice, faint, coming from the trees. It was saying my name. "Daniel." I froze. It was distant, almost like the wind. But then Eric stiffened beside me. "Did you guys hear that?" he asked. Before I could respond, it came again. But this time, it called Eric's name. "Eric." The voice was identical to his own. The fire crackled, but no one moved. I could see the fear in everyone's faces. Sam grabbed his flashlight and pointed it toward the trees. "Who's there?" Silence. Then, the voice called again. This time, it said Sam's name, and it sounded exactly like him. That was when we knew this wasn't normal. Josh stood up, his voice unsteady. "It's got to be a prank, right?" Then from the opposite direction, another voice whispered, "Josh." I felt a cold sweat break across my back. Sam clicked off his flashlight, and we sat in the dark, listening. Leaves rustled. Something moved between the trees, coming closer. We strained our eyes in the dim firelight, and then we saw them. 4 figures, standing just at the edge of the clearing, not moving, not speaking. I could barely make them out, but something was wrong. Their bodies were too still, too rigid. Then the flashlight flickered back on for a split second, just enough time for me to see their faces. They looked just like us, but their eyes were empty. No emotion, just blank, hollow expressions. That was when they started moving toward us. I grabbed my backpack and ran. The others followed, sprinting toward the trail. Behind us, the voices grew louder, overlapping, calling our names in our own voices. We didn't stop. We ran through the pitch-black woods, lungs burning, barely able to see the ground beneath us. Then, Josh tripped. I turned to help him, but my breath caught in my throat. One of the figures was standing right behind him, its head tilted slightly, watching. Then it took a step forward. Josh screamed. I yanked him up and we bolted. We ran until we saw the faint glow of the truck's headlights. We piled in, slammed the doors shut, and Sam turned the key. The engine stalled. Josh was hyperventilating. "Go, go, go!" Sam turned the key again. Nothing. Then the knocking started. Slow, deliberate taps on the driver's side window. We turned, and there they were, standing outside the truck, our own faces staring back at us, smiling. Then the engine roared to life. Sam floored it. The figures didn't move as we sped past them. They just stood there, their smiles fading as we disappeared down the road. We didn't stop driving until we reached a gas station 20 miles away. Nobody spoke. We just sat there, catching our breath, staring at the empty road. Then Josh pulled out his phone to check the time. His face went pale. It was still midnight. We'd been running for almost an hour, but according to our phones, time never moved. I don't know what we saw that night. I don't know if it was a trick of the mind, a cult, or something much worse. All I know is that the voices in the woods weren't human. And if you ever hear your own voice calling for you in the dark, don't answer. Story 3. The Vanishing Man in the Motel. My name is Alex Carter, and this is not a story. This is something that happened to me. Something I can't explain. Something that still keeps me awake at night. If you're reading this, take it as a warning. Some places are better left untouched, and some doors are better left unopened. It was late October, and I was driving through rural Texas. I'd been on the road for hours, the kind of drive where the landscape blurs into an endless stretch of empty fields and dusty back roads. My GPS had stopped working miles back, and my phone had no signal. I was tired, hungry, and desperate for a place to crash for the night. That's when I saw it, a flickering neon sign that read, Sunset Motel. The place looked like it had been plucked straight out of the 1970s. The paint was peeling, the windows were grimy, and the parking lot was empty except for a single beat-up pickup truck. It wasn't exactly inviting, but it was the only option for miles. I pulled into the lot and stepped inside the lobby. The air smelled like stale cigarettes and mildew. Behind the counter sat an elderly man with a weathered face and tired eyes. He didn't smile when I approached. "Room for the night?" I asked. He nodded silently, sliding a dusty guest book across the counter. As I signed my name, I noticed his hands were trembling. He handed me a key attached to a faded plastic tag that read, Room 12. "Checkout's at 10, he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Don't be late." I thanked him and headed to my room. The motel was eerily quiet, the only sound the crunch of gravel under my boots. Room 12 was at the far end of the building, next to room 11. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a dimly lit space with yellowed wallpaper and a sagging bed. It wasn't exactly the Ritz, but it would do for the night. I settled in, unpacked my bag, and tried to relax. But something about the place felt off. The air was heavy, like the walls were pressing in on me. I told myself it was just my imagination, the result of too many hours on the road. Around 3 a.m., I was jolted awake by a sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, a low, mournful wail that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. But as I listened, it became clearer. It wasn't the wind, it was sobbing. The sound was coming from the room next door, room 11. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The sobbing was muffled but unmistakable, a raw, gut-wrenching sound that sent chills down my spine. I told myself to ignore it, to roll over and go back to sleep. But I couldn't. The sound was too human, too desperate. Then, the sobbing stopped. For a moment, there was silence, and then whispers. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was urgent, almost pleading. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, until they suddenly cut off, leaving the room in dead silence. I lay there, frozen, my ears straining for any sound. But there was nothing, just the faint hum of the motel's ancient air conditioner. I didn't sleep much after that. As soon as the sun rose, I packed my things and headed to the lobby. The same elderly man was behind the counter, sipping a cup of coffee. He looked up as I approached, his expression unreadable. "Morning," I said, trying to sound casual. I was wondering who was staying in room 11 last night. The man's face went pale. He set his coffee cup down slowly, his hands trembling again. "Room 11's been empty for years," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I frowned. That's impossible. I heard someone in there last night, sobbing, whispering. It went on for hours. The man shook his head, his eyes darting toward the door as if he expected someone, or something, to walk in. You must have been dreaming, he said. Room 11 hasn't been rented out since, since the incident. What incident? I asked, my stomach sinking. He hesitated, then leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. About 10 years ago, a man checked into room 11. He was just passing through like you, paid in cash, kept to himself. But the next morning he was gone. No note, no trace, just vanished. I stared at him, my mind racing. What happened to him? The man shook his head again. No one knows. The police searched the room, the grounds, even the surrounding area. Nothing. But folks around here say he never really left. That if you listen close enough, you can still hear him, sobbing, whispering, begging for someone to let him out. I left the motel that morning with a knot in my stomach and a chill I couldn't shake. I didn't look back as I drove away, but I could feel the weight of the place lingering behind me, like a shadow I couldn't outrun. To this day, I don't know what I heard that night. Was it the man who vanished, a trick of the mind, or something else entirely? All I know is this: some places hold on to the past, and some doors should never be opened. If you ever find yourself at the Sunset Motel, do yourself a favor. Keep driving, because once you check in, you might not check out. Story 4. The Smiling Woman on the Highway. My name is Jack Harper, and I've been a long-haul truck driver for over a decade. I've driven through every kind of weather, every kind of terrain, and every kind of night. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened on Highway 47. This isn't just a story. This is something I lived through, something I can't forget. And if you're reading this, take it as a warning. Some roads are better left untraveled, and some faces are better left unseen. It was a cold, moonless night in late November. I was hauling a load of machinery from Lubbock to El Paso, a route I'd driven 100 times before. The highway was deserted, the kind of empty that makes you feel like the last person on Earth. My radio was crackling with static, and the only light came from my headlights cutting through the darkness. I was tired, but I had another 3 hours to go before I could stop for the night. That's when I saw her. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow maybe, or a deer standing too close to the road. But as I got closer, I realized it was a woman. She was standing on the shoulder, her back to the highway, her long dark hair blowing in the wind. She was wearing a white dress, the kind that looked like it belonged in another era, and she was barefoot, in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the night. I slowed down, my instincts kicking in. Maybe she was in trouble. Maybe she needed help. But as I got closer, she turned to face me, and she smiled. It wasn't a normal smile. It was too wide, too sharp, like her face had been stretched too far. Her eyes were fixed on me, unblinking, and her grin never wavered. My stomach turned. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. I hit the gas, my heart pounding in my chest. I told myself it was just my imagination, just the fatigue playing tricks on me. But when I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw her. She was in the back of my truck, sitting there, staring at me with that same unnerving smile. I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching against the asphalt. The truck skidded to a stop, and I jumped out, my flashlight in hand. I scanned the back of the truck, the trailer, the road behind me. There was no one there, no woman, no sign that anyone had been there at all. I told myself I was losing it. I got back in the truck and drove, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station about 20 miles down the road. It was a small, run-down place, the kind that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1980s. The clerk behind the counter was a middle-aged man with a bored expression. He barely looked up when I walked in. "You okay, buddy?" he asked, his voice flat. I need to check my truck," I stammered. "I think someone might be in there." He raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. He grabbed a set of keys and followed me outside. We searched the truck from top to bottom, inside and out. There was no one there. No woman. No sign of anyone. "You sure you didn't just imagine it?" the clerk asked, his tone skeptical. I shook my head. "I saw her. She was in the back of my truck. I swear," he sighed and led me back inside. "We've got security cameras. Let's take a look." We went into a small room behind the counter, where a grainy black and white monitor showed the feed from the cameras outside. The clerk rewound the footage, and we watched as my truck pulled into the station. At first, everything looked normal, but then as I got out of the truck, something caught my eye. There was a figure in the back of the truck, a woman. She was sitting there just like I'd seen her. But her face was wrong. It wasn't a face at all. It was just a dark, blurry void, like someone had smudged it out of existence, and yet I could still feel her smile, even though I couldn't see it. The clerk froze, his face pale. "What the hell is that?" I didn't have an answer. I still don't. All I know is this: some roads are haunted, and some things are better left unseen. If you ever find yourself driving down Highway 47 at night, and you see a woman standing by the side of the road, don't stop. Don't slow down. Just keep driving, because once she sees you, she won't let go.